In the fifth argument, we get something that Chaz Smith calls the simple proof test. He presents the argument as follows. The term wet is an adjective that is only conditional, that is used to describe the surface of something that is typically dry. Ladies and gentlemen, here's the simple proof test. This counter is dry. You pour water on it, it becomes wet. Can it be dried? Absolutely. Therefore, it was wet, it is now dry. The water on the inside of the bottle, however, can it be dried? Absolutely the frick not. And again, the intended conclusion is water is not wet. And I will give you a summary of the argument the way it's supposed to work on the following slide. So my summary of the argument is contained here. This is how I think things are supposed to work. Notice that there are a few parts of the argument that are not explicitly stated, but I think pretty clearly have to be included in order for the argument to work the way that it's intended to work. So I think that the first line of this passage, which again is a claim about the definition of the word wet or the way that the word wet ought to be used, I think that claim is supposed to be supported in part by this claim and this proof test, this demonstration of pouring water on the counter and whether or not the counter can be dried afterwards. So if water is poured on the counter becomes wet, then the counter can become dried. So it's sort of like the wet thing, or the thing that has become wet can become dry. And I think that that little example is supposed to support the general claim that wet is an adjective that's only conditional, that's used to describe the surface of something that's typically dry. But interestingly, that claim alone, which is represented here as C1, wouldn't really be enough to support the conclusion in combination with the further example about the bottle. What's important, I think, is another claim that's not explicitly stated, but it is implicit here. And that's the claim that anything that can be wet can also be dried. And so, if the idea is if something can't be dried, then it can't have been wet. And that's going to be important because the further claim in P3 here is the water on the inside of the bottle can't be dried. And it's the combination of that claim, that the water on the inside of the bottle can't be dried, and the implicit claim that anything that can be wet can also be dried, that leads so seemingly, certainly, to the conclusion that water cannot be wet. It's worth noting that this part of the argument, which is represented by these implicit components on their way to the conclusion, is an example of a form of inference that has been recognized for a long time called modus tollens. It's a deductively valid form of inference, which means that if the premises are true, then the conclusion is necessarily true, or the conclusion is guaranteed to be true. Any argument that has this form and also has true premises is one that must have a true conclusion. Maybe that's why Chaz Smith was so confident to say that this was a proof, not just a reason to believe, not just an inductive argument, but a deductive argument, a proof. So you can see how that works. It's if A then B, that is, if anything is wet, it can be dried. Not B, this thing, water, can't be dried, therefore not A. That's modus tollens. One more small point, C3, as represented here, is also not stated explicitly. Chaz Smith talks about the water on the inside of the bottle and takes the water on the inside of the bottle, which can't be dried, to be emblematic or to be a representative sample or a representative example of what water is always like. So I think the point of that is just that there is an inference from P3, this particular case of water that can't be dried, to the general claim that water cannot be dried in C3 that has to be made in order for this proof or this test in order to function as a proof or a test of the conclusion. And one possible way of pointing out the significance of that is with a possible objection that Smith actually discusses part of in the future video, which is the example of ice. So ice is made of water chemically, right? It's H2O. And so in that sense, we could say, this ice cube, right? We could say is a case of water, just like the water in the water bottle is. But can the ice be dried? I mean, if the ice is wet, can one dry off the water on the surface of the ice? It seems like one can. And if one is in an environment that is, say, below freezing, where the ice itself isn't melting, and one pours some water on the ice and then dries it off, it seems quite possible that ice in that circumstance, which is itself a case of water, can be dried. So my point there is just to say that the inference from P3 to C3 is questionable. And then that's not the only possible objection to the argument, but that's one possible objection, which points out the importance of this implicit inference in the argument. Another possible objection here actually works in a similar way. It's to challenge the inference from P1 and P2 to the general claim in C1. P1 and P2 give an example of something that is dry, can be wetted, and then can be dried again. And from that example, they want to claim, Chaz Smith wants to claim that the term wet is an adjective that's used to describe the surface of something that's typically dry, or even the general claim, anything that can be wet can also be dried. But it can be wondered whether this one case is really enough to secure that general conclusion. The fact that the counter is dry and can be wetted and dried again, does that mean that every single case where we use the word wet has to be one where the thing can be dried? That in a way is a kind of leap beyond what the premises themselves support. So another way to put that is that the inference even if the inference at the end of the argument from C2 and C3 to C4 is a deductively valid argument, even if that part is deductively valid and is a deductive argument, the argument from P1 and P2 to C1 is an inductive argument that's based on just a single case, and so it's questionable. The last argument presented reads as follows, so the transcript reads as follows: and in closing, the definition of wet reads covered or saturated with water or another liquid. Water cannot be covered or saturated with itself. Thank you. And again, the implication is that this argument is a very strong argument against the view that water can be wet, and a very strong argument in favor of the view that water is not wet. I think we can represent this argument as follows. And notice that there is, again, an important implicit premise here, I think, which is intended to support. I think you sort of have to assume this in order to be convinced of what's represented as C1 here, that water cannot be covered or saturated with itself. Isn't it implied by this argument that a thing cannot be covered or saturated with itself? That there's something paradoxical or impossible about the claim that a thing is covered by itself or saturated with itself. Okay. But again, noticing the importance of that implicit premise allows us to notice also a potential objection here. Because why should we insist that things can never be covered or saturated with things of the same kind? So here's an example. Can I cover a blanket with another blanket? If I can do that, then why can't I cover some water with some other water? If I mix two liquids together, if I have, say, some Coca-Cola here and some Coca-Cola here, and I mix them together, could I say that the two glasses of Coke have become saturated with each other? So I think the point there is we have to think about we have to think about the water not just as a homogeneous entity, but of kind of bits of water, and think, is it possible for some bits of water, say molecules of water, to be on top of or surrounding other molecules of water, other bits of water? Is it possible for water molecules from one glass and water molecules from another glass to saturate each other? That may not be the technical chemical definition of saturation, but it's just saturated can mean a lot of things. Permeated with would be a possible synonym. So the point again is that we can actually potentially imagine water being covered or saturated with itself. So C1 is not as strong a conclusion, or not as strong a claim, not as reliable or certain a claim as Chaz Smith perhaps thinks it is, or presents it as being in this argument. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this argument analysis of Chaz Smith's video, and I look forward to hearing what you think in the comments.